I'm Liam.
I'm Wayne.
You're listening to In Film We Trust YouTube.
A place where we post clips from our recent episode.
All links down below in the description.
And now, on with the show.
Are you a big fan of slasher films?
I do really like slashers, Wayne. I loved them as a teenager.
Actually loved them.
Loved them. It was one of the first genres, I think, that I was aware that this was a genre and there was a formula to it. But the interesting thing is, the more you watch them, the more you appreciate them, because you see there's a history to them, don't you?
There's a very long history, yeah. In fact, when I was doing research, I'm surprised it actually goes back to the 19th century, because in Paris, there was a theatre called, I think I'm saying this right, Grand Guignol.
Yep,
and it was horror plays. So they put these horror plays on, which were incredibly controversial. And have you heard of the Hays Code in America?
Yeah, I've heard of the Hays Code.
In a way, that led to the Hays Code, because in America they were so disgusted by this sacrilegious, blasphemous, horrible, violent show that they brought the Hays Code in, which would last from, what, the 20s up until, like, the 50s, something like this? 30s to 50s?
Well, that's the interesting thing about American cinema. In the 20s was far, or in the silent era especially, was far more liberal than it became in the 50s.
Yeah, in fact, if you watch Wings, the first Academy Award winner, when I watched it, there's actually a scene where you see, like, a woman's bare breasts in a mirror. You would not have seen that for another 30-odd years in
Absolutely
American cinema.
disgusting, Wayne.
Absolutely foul.
Absolutely vile.
It's someone please think of the children.
Yes, please, the eyes, protect the eyes.
Yeah, but then into the 1920s, because if you think with your 20s and 30s, you had movies like Dracula, and there's a film called The Bat, 1920s. Now, listen to this this basic
I'm guessing that's a horror, Wayne.
Yes, listen to this. People in a remote mansion are being attacked by a killer in a mask.
Do they get off one by one?
Probably, yeah. I mean, that to me sounds like a very stereotypical slasher movie.
Yeah, slashers have a definite formula. For me, as far as we want to go back to these Paris roots and that, I'd say when we're talking about slasher, we can kind of appropriate it to about Peepin' Tom in 1960.
Peepin' Tom.
Michael Powell directed, weirdly director of The Red Shoes.
Oh, he was the Red Shoes as well.
Because Peepin' Tom almost killed off his career because it was seen as sleazy. Which is not a film you'd assume the director of The Red Shoes would make.
No, not really. Well, the thing is, the 1960, because you hadn't had, I guess, the swinging 60s folk were still maybe a bit more conservative back then. But also, because was Peeping Tom not 1960?
1960, same as Psycho. But Peeping Tom, interestingly, it's actually mentioned in Scream, Wayne, because I think, I can't remember the character, but he says it's the first film to put the viewer in the killer's point of view.
I heard about that. But let's go back even further, actually. The 1940s, there's a film called The Scarlet Claw, which is a Sherlock Holmes kind of mystery. And you know that classic shot in a slasher film where you see someone's hand, you see the killer's hand coming down like this over and over? That was apparently one of the first films, maybe the first film to ever do that.
I hope his hand was gloved.
Yes, I hope his hand was. Funny that you mentioned that. 2 years later, The Spiral Staircase features a woman trying to survive attacks from a black-gloved killer.
What is it with black gloves? Why black gloves?
I don't know, it just keeps coming up.
The Italians loved a black glove in the 70s.
It does, because like I was going to say, as we've addressed some time ago with Barbarian, it was a big characteristic of Giallo films.
Giallo films? Well, Mario Bava's 1971 of Bay of Blood literally was a direct influence on Friday the 13th. Literally shot for shot kills were copied. You know when in Friday the 13th, whichever character is killed through a spear coming from under the bed.
It's Kevin Bacon, that, wasn't it?
Bay of Blood.
Well,
in Bay of Blood.
What? When does a homage kind of blend into a rip-off?
Just to a rip-off, well.
Basically a rip-off, basically, yeah. But yeah, with your 60s, it was, again, with things like in Psycho and Peeping Tom, it was, this material was previously unacceptable. But because Hitchcock and, who was the Peeping Tom director?
Michael Powell.
Because they broke these barriers, it paved the way for films in the 70s. For me, I think the first real early slash was something like Black Christmas.
Well done, Wayne. I would say this is the first formulaic slasher.
Which does not get the praise it should do.
It's always referred to as a precursor to slasher.
But why a precursor, not the first one? Because if you look at a lot of its traits, it's got a lot of the kind of archetypical things. You've got a group of people who are all isolated in a room.
A bunch of girls, an isolated location, a killer, off one by one.
Exactly, with some bags over the heads, knives. I'm pretty sure we have killer perspective in this film as well.
You know what it is, Wayne?
What is it?
North Americans hate Canadians. And Bob
it's
Clark.
Canadian Bob Clark.
Yes.
Yeah. Man, he did Black Christmas and A Christmas Story. How does that
And
even...
Porky's.
And
He
Porky's.
literally created the slasher, the sex comedy, and a perennial Christmas classic.
But then he finished his career on Baby Geniuses 2.
Yeah, we pretend that didn't happen.
Yeah,
Wayne.
let's just ignore that didn't happen. Also, was 74 not the year of Texas Chainsaw Massacre?
It was not a slasher, but
Maybe not a slasher, but
we're
still...
getting into the territory. It's usually referred to as an exploitation horror, which why is Halloween not exploitation?
Almost like a documentary exploitation, isn't it? Because of the way it was shot.
But yeah, as you said, Black Christmas, to me, look, I don't care about much for all these labels, etc. To me, I'm going as that's the first slasher, isn't it?
For me, yeah, because you look at
Especially
Halloween.
American slasher.
Halloween is basically, like you say, kind of an American Black Christmas, isn't it? And it led to, again, we say Halloween, and later on we led to things like Friday the 13th, which will come up a lot in this podcast.
Well, if you look at the trajectory of slashers, in hindsight, what is referred to now as the golden age is 78 to 84. 78 being the key year because obviously Halloween. Yes. So in this time, you're getting Prom Night, you're getting The Burning, you're getting My Bloody Valentine, Nightmare on Elm Street. So Halloween is clearly set the pace here, hasn't it? It's created the formula, or popularized the formula, because as we said with Black Christmas in 74, the formula is almost set there, isn't it? But Halloween here it's popularizing now a formula.
Yeah. So when we get to Halloween, this is when people decide, right, this is what a slasher film is.
Yes.
And after this, we have so many films which don't necessarily copy the formula, but utilize the formula.
Oh no, they copy the formula. You have an opening, a shocking opening, what sets up the story. You're introduced to a bunch of characters. Most of them are going to be unlikable, so you don't care about them dying.
A lot of them are often teenagers as well.
They're always teenagers.
That kind of obnoxious teenager thing, yeah. And it led to things like Nightmare on Elm Street, which, as we've said at one point, it kind of brought the supernatural element in. So did Child's Play as well.
Child's Play, yeah, to a point, yeah.
Yeah, and the thing is, because like you say, from 78 to 84, the golden age, the problem is, after a while, there was so many sequels, wasn't there? Like, so many of these things became franchises because they cost very little to make and they almost guaranteed turned a profit.
Well, slashers in the late 70s, early 80s was almost like, you know how we referred to in our Creep episode, the found footage genre. It's almost the equivalent. It's where filmmakers could make really cheap work and maximize a profit.
Exactly. Even series nowadays, like the Saw movies, because they don't cost very much, you can make... Again, you just need to build that brand, that recognizability. The thing with these slasher films is they start off good, you have a good, interesting idea, but again, then they just milk it so much and things go off the rails. Like the Friday the 13th, Jason went into space at one point.
As you do.
Was it Jason X? Yeah, they went into space.
When you've got no one else to kill, you look for aliens.
So ridiculous. You know what other franchise has done that? Fast and the Furious.
Did they go to space?
They went to space in the last one, yeah.
I'm glad I missed that one.
How did they get it? Where did they go on the next
Interestingly, talking of space, is Alien a slasher film?
Ooh. It's referred to as a haunted house movie in space.
Well, it's a formula. You have a creature. You have the bad guy, literally.
Yeah.
You have a group of people trapped in a location. And are they off one by one?
They are off.
Well, they are off one by one.
Makes sense. I actually rewatched Alien. I think so. It was last week. That still really holds up.
It does hold up. It's a great film.
It is a fantastic film. Yeah, it's brilliant.
And then you obviously have in the 90s, after you had all these films like we mentioned, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, My Bloody Valentine. You had the 90s resurgence.
Yeah, and this is where the kind of self-referential humor came in, because especially with Scream, directed by Wes Craven, a horror maestro, where it's like they're making a film. It's its own horror film, but it's also making fun of its influences, you could say. Funnily
enough, though, Wes Craven, I'm trying to think how many years, maybe a couple of years prior to Scream, or a few years prior, done A New Nightmare, which was a meta take on the whole A Nightmare on Elm Street.
It even featured the lead actress, didn't it?
Yes, it did. They were they were playing themselves.
Yeah.
They weren't the characters, they were playing themselves, and in the world of A New Nightmare, A Nightmare on Elm Street was fictional, but now it comes to permeate real life.
So you have the era of slasher flicks, and then we have the era of metaphysical slasher flicks, basically.
Yeah, the whole meta horror.
Yeah, but then Scream even did the same thing, because Scream is now, what are we at, 5 films now?
5 films.
I haven't watched any after the third one, but
no?
it's the same thing. It's like they have this great idea, but they just make another film and another film. I'm pretty sure, I think Scream 2 actually made fun of films that have so many sequels.
Well, there is that scene when they're trying to name what sequels are good, and I think we kind of settle on Terminator 2 and Godfather 2.
Yeah, those things come up. Aliens as well. The same things come up over and over again. Yeah. But yeah, for slasher, it's got an incredibly rich history. I think for me, a lot of the franchises are run into the ground.
But in the 90s, what you would find as well with the resurgence of the slasher craze, they were a very different take. They had the formula. You had the opening at the start where something horrific would happen, and it would lead to the people being killed off one by one. But what you kind of got was an appropriation or a change in politics, whereas the 80s was kind of... Slashers were almost, for sleazy as they were in the 80s, there was a conservative outlook. The more permissive, the more liberal the character was, the more they were killed, and the more chaste victim usually survived.
Yeah, with the trope again, they made fun of this in Scream, that the virgin is the one who survives.
Yes, the virginal one, yes. And actually, the final girl term wasn't actually referred to until the early 90s. In a book by Carl Clover, she wrote a book called Men, Women and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film. And that's actually where we got the term final girl. So what the hell did they refer to, were they referred to in the 80s?
The virginal girl?
I have no idea.
I have no idea, because would you argue that Jamie Lee Curtis is one of the most famous ones?
Oh, she's kind of... We can pin her up as the original Scream Queen.
Because she's the Scream Queen, isn't she?
She's the original. She's the GOAT.